Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Ministry of Propaganda. Me and Chris tonight are going to be talking about all sorts of geopolitical developments. There's a lot going on. Iran, Saudi deal, Xi-Putin meeting, other meetings and discussions with Syria and Turkey, TikTok CEO being grilled, a democracy summit in America, which the Chinese have countered with their own summit, and some great commentary coming out of some African leaders. And also, yes, an arrest warrant for Putin, Putin the war criminal. So, Chris, where do you want to begin?
So it's been quite a big one, hasn't it? It seems to be showing sort of cracks in the Western sort of bloc are starting to appear. I say starting. We've seen this start for quite a while now. Obviously, one of the ones that really caught our interest was the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Beijing, sponsored by the Chinese. Obviously, this is a deal that is very upsetting for the Americans. One, because it's one of their puppets making peace with one of their enemies. Two, it's hosted by China. America hates China being perceived as a peacemaker on the world stage. They want to be the only ones negotiating any peace deal, whether it be from Israel to Palestine, from the United Kingdom to Ireland. America love to be the ones sponsoring these quote unquote peace agreements. So for China to be sort of taking this mantle from them, it's got to sting a little bit.
It's definitely China showing leadership in the world. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been effectively some people have called it a Cold War, a Middle Eastern Cold War for a decade, we could say. And for them to cross, the Gulf and try and repair their relations and try and start. So, I mean, I don't think this is necessarily the end of all of that tension, that underlying tension. But I think that it's definitely the beginning. And yeah, for the Chinese to do this, to broker this, this was Xi's, sort of global statesman sort of statement, I guess. And he's just, been re-elected at the CCPPCC, the basically the Chinese parliament. He's obviously been ratified as the president. Obviously, we know that the Congress, the party's Congress was end of last year.
Yes.
And yeah, so now he's the president, and this is one of his first things as the leader of China, re-elected, is to make this deal, which I think is a great, and this is a positive thing. This is a good thing, and you're absolutely right that Saudi Arabia doing this pivot, turning to the east, is quite. This is quite a big development. At the same time, they haven't quite abandoned the US. It's still their big arms supplier. They still have all these US bases. But I think this is also going to be most positive, actually, for the guys in Yemen, the Yemenese people, Yemenis. I don't know how to say it, sorry. But they are the ones, obviously, who I think you could say them, the Syrians and the Iraqis were the ones that bore the most sort of brunt of this of this Cold War, this Middle Eastern Cold War. So I think it's really good for them. There's a great picture that a French cartoonist drew, Carl Latuff. This one here. This is a good one here. So the big, strong panda holding the bridge over the Gulf between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And you've got then America and Israel sort of angrily sitting there with their detonator, hoping to try and blow up this bridge. Which I think Latuff is a great cartoonist. So this is a pretty accurate depiction of what's going on and who's upset.
Yes. And it is, obviously, it's a huge sort of blow to Israel as well. Recently, if anyone doesn't know, Israel has been basically in a state of complete protest for the past couple of weeks over judicial reforms that Netanyahu is trying to get through. Now, Netanyahu's just been as a visit to the UK to meet the Prime Minister here. And it was quite interesting, the mixed messages that came out of that meeting, where our Prime Minister says, the meeting was about restoring calm and order to Israel over their protests. But Netanyahu said, we just talked about the threat from Iran. That did you though, or did you talk about the threat from Iran and them talked about you getting stability at home and putting your ducks in order and stop trying to be a dictator and take over your courts? It seems it's a huge talking point for them. Obviously, America are going to be absolutely devastated. Just to sort of flush things out, this deal, it is a deal, an agreement to restore diplomacy. For the past, I think since 2013, they've not had embassies in each of the countries. Obviously, Iran, as you alluded to, have been sponsoring and arming the Houthis in Yemen, and along with North Korea, actually, some of the weapons there. But I think a lot of the weapons probably have a common sort of ancestry in terms of design and manufacture anyway. I think a lot of the designs for both of them actually come from the Pakistani weapons program, but that's by the by. So yeah, a lot seems to be happening, and it's come at a time, obviously, with the protests in Iran, which are still there, but you hear less and less of them. They do seem to be calming down. It seems to be now that the American sort of hopes and fantasy last year that this was going to topple the government doesn't seem to have happened and isn't happening. I think the Iranian government is going to sort of reform itself out of it slightly. But yeah, these do seem to be positive developments, and it just shows that this sort of diplomatic narrative that the West have been portraying, or of them leading the diplomatic angle of their countries, doesn't seem to be working anymore. Countries are starting to think for themselves again.
Yeah, definitely. And also you could say regionality. So, this is regional politics. Obviously, the Chinese brokered and used their clout to build the bridge, so to speak. But it still definitely is very much regionality as well. So that conflict was also regional. But you did have America behind Saudi Arabia and sort of advancing and pushing that sort of antagonism against Iran. So yeah, this is the emergence of regionalism beyond the unipolar or even bipolar world, which is positive, and that's where things are going. Also coming to sort of the next part of the diplomatic discussion is, obviously Xi and Putin met in Moscow, but at the same time, Putin also hosted a number of other leaders from that region. So we had, I think he was speaking to Erdogan as well as Assad and Saudi Arabia to sort of see how they could piece things together. So I'm trying to jump ahead to this article here. Putin meets Assad as Russia pushes for Syria-Turkey accords. This thing obviously follows, potential deal follows China's success in Iran's Saudi deal, but we're seeing then a four-way talk with Moscow, Iran, Syria, and Turkey to try and then alleviate and end and move on from the discussion, the conflict in Syria, which is great. I think it's going to be quite awkward though. There'll be a Saigon moment, a Kabul moment for those American troops though that are still in Syria guarding the oil fields there.
And again, I feel like this is a war now that has no right to have dragged on as long as it has done. ISIS is now a rear view memory. I mean, I'm almost shocked and surprised there aren't Oscar-worthy films about ISIS at this point. That they're a figure of history now. The conflict itself, when you look at the civil war maps of Syria, what used to be the Free Syrian Army, I think now they've rebranded themselves again to the Syrian National Army, confusingly, considering they're not the Syrian National Army.
Right.
They hold a fraction of the territory that they ever held. Turkey actually hold more territory now than they do. The opposition, the democratic opposition, has smashed itself into about 11 different Islamist groups, not as democratic as they may have led you to want to believe. Which is almost a joke in itself that you could ever have had a democratic front being led by al-Nusra and
right. I think the pieces of those global regional efforts too, actually. So Turkey, we always kind of knew how are these Syrian democratic forces or the rebels, the democratic rebels, how are they being able to fight the Syrian government? They're obviously all coming through the Turkish border. Are the Turks allowing this? And now that, I mean, obviously this is old news, that they have Turkish watchtowers within Syrian territory. It was very obvious where and how that opposition was funded and supported. But hopefully, we see the end of this and we see Turkish troops going back, and the Syrian government, the Syrian people being able to decide their own fate for themselves.
And the fact that it is Turkey who's involved in this, and this is one of the real interesting things, is that, again, it's these cracks in the Western alliance. Turkey itself being a member of NATO, a former applicant of the EU, because it's got its tippy toe in Europe, it thinks it's European. But it doesn't behave like a member of NATO, and it doesn't behave like a member of an applicant of the EU. It's very much a loose cannonball on the deck. The fact that it has so many meetings, agreements, and just discussions with Russia and with essentially adversaries of the West, and so many engagements and agreements with them. It just shows that this alliance isn't unified at all.
Absolutely, yeah. Just coming back to Syria and Saudi. So we talked about Iran and Saudi, and of course then Putin trying to piece things together as well. We also have, here, so this is quite recently, let's check the date. So this is the 24th of March, so yeah, only 6 days ago. You have Assad hoping to also, in talks over resumption of consular services between the two countries. So yeah, this is definitely happening. Even though, that they were just talking in Moscow and Putin was pushing this thing. You can see they're also doing it amongst each other themselves. So Saudis and Syria are also in their own talks. So I think this is definitely happening. I think we're seeing the end of that sort of regional Cold War conflict. You said a loose cannonball on the deck. I just wanted to mention another sort of, you could say a loose cannonball in some respects, maybe not the same way, but you have the UN Security Council recently held a vote on whether they should allow an independent investigation, or probe, I should say, into the Nord Stream blast explosion. So, so China regrets the United Nations Security Council rejection to probe Nord Stream blasts, questions US blocking of resolution. Okay, so on Monday of this week, the UNSC rejected a Russia-submitted draft resolution urging an independent international investigation into the Nord Stream blasts by a vote of 3 in favor. And here's your cannonball: China, Russia, Brazil, to none against, with 12 abstentions, including the US. Okay, so you can see Brazil is still voting, with bricks in this sense here. In India, not so much. So that's a cannonball, I guess, for both sides. The Indians aren't quite, they have problems with China, but they are very good friends with Russia. Russia provides their arms. So yes, I just think this is quite interesting. I mean, and also just on the actual matter itself, this is an independent UN-led investigation, or it would have been. So had this passed, this vote, that meant the UN Secretary General would have then been forced to come up with a panel and organize an investigation under the UN. They voted against it. So yeah, any thoughts on this, Chris?
Yeah, just the fact that they're abstained, it kind of makes me laugh. I watch a lot of sort of law programs and stuff with my fiance. That always makes me laugh in American courts whenever you've got that obviously guilty cop or anything, and they get asked a question, did you plant this? And I plead the fifth. I kind of answer as it may incriminate me. And it's just like such an obvious, I did it, but I'm legally allowed not to say. And that's basically what America are doing. A general actually regarding this a few weeks ago in their investigations said that they believe it was conducted by a pro-Ukrainian party. Well, you are that pro-Ukrainian party. So I can neither confirm nor deny. But It is, you are the pro-Ukrainian party.
I mean, we were going to try and get Seymour Hersh to try and speak to us. Maybe we'll get lucky and he'll speak to us. He's quite a busy guy, as you can imagine. Yes. But one of the things that we were going to bring up with him is any of the forms of whoever you think did the Nord Stream attack, none of them have good outcomes. So if it's Russia, that means the Russians attacked German infrastructure. So it's Article 5 of NATO. Okay, that's if it's the Russians, if you think it's the Russians.
Yep.
If it's any other NATO partner, so Britain or whatever, the same applies. It's an attack on Germany, an attack on NATO. Okay.
Yeah.
If it's the US, then it's still the US attacking German infrastructure and Russian infrastructure. So you have sort of a threat of nuclear war from the Russian side, but then you have a very bizarre question of, well, the US is attacking key German infrastructure, which has led to the closure of metal plants and all sorts of economic impacts. So that's also not a good outcome. So, and then the fourth one, okay, Ukraine did it. Okay, so Ukraine attacked Europe. So none of these options are good.
Yeah. I think for the West, it's more convenient not to investigate because they don't, like I said, they don't want to see what the answer is because the answer might be embarrassing to them. If the goal was simply to stop Europe using Russian gas, they were only a couple of sanctions away from being able to achieve that anyway. They didn't need to attack the infrastructure. And the fact that Russia's been repairing it, that was almost like a joke accusation anyway, that they even said that, oh, Russia did it to themselves, that they literally control the dialect lever and they could have just turned it off. That's what they needed to do. And now the evidence on the ground very much hints that it essentially was one of our countries.
That's it. On the sort of plus side, some Chinese observers, as the Global Times writes, Chinese observers suggested there could be an alternative to an international probe into the Nord Stream sabotage. Russia can propose a draft resolution to the UN General Assembly, where only a majority of the members is needed to be present to vote on and adopt a resolution. So this might not be the end of this one. The General Assembly might have to decide on it. And I mean, I think it's a decent proposal, whether you're a US-backed or funded puppet state or whatever. You're talking about an attack on international infrastructure. So we live in a digital age with transatlantic cables and all sorts of things running across these ocean beds, whether that's gas or electricity or whatever. So this is definitely extremely important to everyone that we figure out who did it and find the culprits.
Yeah, I always find it quite interesting that it's at this time now when that's been done, because obviously the Soviet Union was supplying gas to Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that the Soviet Union had McDonald's towards the end of the 90s. And it's almost like after all the ideological conflict that happened during the Cold War of capitalism versus communism, it's like they seem to hate now modern Russia more than they ever did that. It's like you let the Soviet Union have McDonald's, but you don't let the Russian Federation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, this is true. There's actually, I mean, and what was it? There was something we talked about before about the fact that someone attended the funeral. It was even the Soviet Union was allowed to attend some funeral. There was the Queen's funeral, wasn't it? I think that was it. Yes, the Queen's funeral was even attended by. Yes, it was the other way around. When that doesn't matter. The point still stands. Yes, it was something that the fact that Russia is actually in worse books and in a badder sort of worse doghouse than the Soviet Union was in the West side, at least.
The fact that they didn't allow Putin to attend a World War II celebration in Europe to celebrate the victors of World War II, but they invited Germany for their contribution.
Yes, great contribution. Thank you for your contribution. Okay, let's talk about this. So obviously we're still talking a bit about the Chinese international sort of motions and diplomacy, but the US obviously has been hosting the Summit for Democracy, and there's been some great stuff that the Chinese have released and organized in response. I'll play the video of an African leader talking about it in a bit, but I think what I want to show you first is I think this is very well timed. So this report is it's the Chinese government's report on human rights violations in the United States. So I'll bring this up here for us, and then we can talk about this. So have you heard about this, Chris?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, so here it is. We're not going to read the whole thing, of course, but it's got some great excerpts and some shocking excerpts, really. I mean, obviously, we shouldn't, take too much pride in how bad human rights violations in the United States are. But it's interesting to talk about these things because of how the leaders and the regime in the US tries to tout itself as the defender of human rights and the defenders of freedom and the defenders of democracy and all of this stuff. So it obviously talks about all sorts of things, things about gun control. So, for example, more than 80,000 people were killed or injured by gun violence in 2022. And there were more than 600 mass shootings. And obviously, a few days ago, we had another mass shooting. And I believe the statistics are something like we've already had 2 every day for this year in the US.
130 so far this year, I believe. I say them, America.
Yes, yeah.
The country where this happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. Another thing they bring up, of course, is money in politics. And if you are interested to see how money in politics plays a role, go onto a website called opensecrets.org. It's an NGO that tries to track as much as it can money in politics and who gets paid for what. And you can see some of it is quite open. How much Marco Rubio gets paid by the private prison industrial complex, prisons for profit that have prisoners that don't work for money. So there's a word for that. What is it, Chris? I'm not sure what it might be.
Lobbying?
Slaves. Yeah. Anyway, so we've got money in politics. So apparently there were, for the midterms, more than $16.7 billion were poured into politics, and donations from billionaires accounted for 15% of the federal total, up from 11% in the 2020 election. So billionaires are having more of an effect on politics. That's democracy.
And that's not new to anybody who pays attention to this information. Obviously, some people in the American sort of center will be scratching their heads and absolutely surprised by that fact. But
other thing they mention here, of course, life expectancy has gone down in America, partly due to drug abuse, but it's down to 76.1 years, which is the lowest since 1996. And as we've mentioned before, it's now lower than the Chinese life expectancy, considering that they have 4 times the amount of people. That's pretty poor on the Americans to, have the inability to provide for a smaller group of people. And apparently, 100,000 people die from drug abuse every year in the States. Yeah,
that is pretty shocking. I saw that in a statistic. Go back onto the gun section, and that gun violence has now overtaken cars as the biggest killer of children in America, and that is pretty insane thing to not take action on. Obviously, the Americans, even some leftists online, which really gets on my nerves, where they intentionally pretend to not know what an assault rifle is. And they'll say things like, oh, you want to ban assault rifles, but you can't even define what an assault rifle is. So, see that village? We're going to attack that village. Shall we take muskets? No. What shall we take with us? The assault rifle. You know what an assault rifle is. Don't pretend you don't. It's an insulting to pretend that you don't.
No, I mean, I don't really engage with the gun debate anymore. Obviously I don't live in America, but it just seems to me that because of the money in politics and all of the propaganda and brainwashing that goes around that with the amendments and rights and all this kind of stuff, that they're not going to fix this problem.
No,
soon.
America aren't, because they've got this sort of holy sort of association of their constitution. Like every country has a constitution, apart from us, and they amend them. They regularly revise the constitution, change it. That's a normal thing for countries to do, and it's weird for America to not have done. And then when they they amend things.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's essentially just sort of Tipexing bits out and changing it for something else. But it's the same essential document for that long. And it is completely out of date. It's not fit for purpose. Guns fire tremendously differently than they did back then. For one, it says you're meant to be in a well-regulated militia, which are going to follow it. The Militia Act in like the 20s, militias are now effectively the National Guard. So that, from the transfer of logic there, if you want a gun, you should be in the army, or at least the National Guard. That is what a well-regulated militia is in American law. But obviously, with drugs, the flow of drugs in America comes from the South to United States, but the guns go from United States to the South. The cartel can bring drugs in, because America armed them so well.
Yeah, it's true. Yes, yeah, almost like some sort of new, transatlantic trade system where drugs and guns are sort of, and then migrants, economic migrants involved too. In fact, actually, that's actually an
migrants flee south, fleeing the guns that the Americans support.
Yes, and also often the immigrants that are held in detention centers are being run by the prison industrial complex, who then gets all of this taxes and money from housing these people. I don't think they've forced them to work yet, but I can very much see them that being a realistic proposal somewhere in some office in America, to pay, to be more efficient with their government, so they can get these illegal immigrants to work for free. I could definitely see that coming off the lips of someone in America. Actually, you talked about the sort of the gun group here. So the Chinese report does say collusion between politicians and businesses paralyzed the gun control agenda. U.S. gun interest groups have mounted powerful political lobbying for their own interests. In defiance of public opinion, the government has drastically relaxed gun controls, allowing guns to be carried in crowded public places such as hospitals, schools, bars, and stadiums. It also talks specifically in New York. They had to overturn a rule for carrying handguns, so you conceal and carry, whatever it's called. Someone sued the New York government, won because of the Constitution, and now you are allowed to carry your handgun openly in New York. So progress, at least in some form, someone's mind. But
it's ridiculous though, and in terms of like personal rights, which they are all about. For me personally, in the UK, if we had laws anywhere similar to that, and say if I was in McDonald's and some guy comes behind me wearing an AR-15 on his back and a revolver on his hip, I'd be pissed off at that. I cannot relax and have a meal. How do I know that you're not a nutter? I have to have that trust in you. You're obviously unhinged because you've just walked into McDonald's with a gun. That in itself doesn't scream the sanest thing to do.
Right, yeah. It's a bit of a catch-22 there. You have to be mad enough to do this. Okay. Yeah. So I think for this report, though, obviously it goes into all sorts, but just to remind people, if they aren't aware as well, just the prisons in America. So according to a report jointly released by the University of Chicago Law School and the American Civil Liberties Union, on June 16th, 2022, the United States incarcerates more than 1.2 million people in state and federal prisons. About 800,000 were engaged in forced labor, accounting for 65% of the total number of prisoners. Over 76% of the prisoners surveyed said they would be punished with solitary confinement, no mitigation, and loss of family visitation rights if they refused to work. Incarcerated workers were forced to provide food service, laundry, and other operations, but they have few rights and protections, said a report by the Prison Policy Initiative on March 14th, 2022. Besides, incarcerated workers typically earn little to no pay at all, according to a research by American Civil Liberties Union on June 15, 2022. American prisons have become veritable modern-day slavery factories. And that statistic, actually 1.2 million, I actually had to write a similar report to this, is going back up. So it's actually down because of COVID. So COVID, you had give or take a year and a half where courtrooms were not operating at full capacity, so they couldn't convict as many people. So that 1.2 million is very low right now, and it's increasing again. So it usually sits at about 2 million people. And that is the most in the world per capita and total. So China and India have less prisoners than America. And America has at least 1 billion less people.
America has the highest prison population ever. Their prison population dwarfs what the Soviet Gulag system was in between a revolution and a world war. But they always like to historically say, "Oh, but Stalin and the Gulag system and how oppressive it was." It's a drop in the ocean compared to.
There's more prisons
The
in
Gulag
America
system
now
in
than there
itself
was in the
is a
Gulag.
subject big enough to dive into in a really interesting way, which we will do one day. But the American system is that oppressive system that they accuse everyone else of. And just what you were saying there with the slavery. Now, obviously, a lot of our audience will be Americans, and they'll probably know this a lot more than us. But the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment in the Constitution that is meant to ban slavery, is credited to ban slavery. It has a clause in there: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. They literally say except, but so we do allow it. They literally just moved the slaves from the cotton fields to the prisons. And
right.
I've had this discussion many times where prison labor, I personally am in favor of prison labor, but prison labor is meant to be reformative. The people that use prison labor are private companies. McDonald's use American prison labor. Nintendo America do. These are private companies. In the state of California, some of the biggest group of firefighters come from prisons. So they literally, when you see these horrendous Californian wildfires where half the state's in flames, and those people battling those fires are prisoners who are there risking their life to do that. There has to be a line of when it's for the common good, which I'm in favor of. The firefighters, I think, is a good thing to do as long as that is voluntary and as long as they're getting some sort of compensation for that, because that is risking your life. If I was in prison for 10 years for fraud and they said you want to go and fight fires, I'd want something back for that. There's some time off at least. But no, I'm not making chips for a company that are using this for profit just so they don't have to pay
so they make money.
wages.
No, I mean, obviously, restorative justice, or not, I forgot what the expression is, but giving people opportunities to have skills so that when they do come out of jail, that they have a skill that is worthy to them, to the country, to the market, whatever you want to call it. So I think there's something to said for that. So breaking rocks with a hammer, probably not that great. But maybe
it's such an old-fashioned sort of view, isn't it? That chain gang stuff. The sheriff on the horse with his shotgun, with his glasses, looking over. Usually, a group of black men in chains hitting hammer onto rocks. I don't even understand what they're actually doing. Like, what are you doing with these little rocks?
I don't know. It seems very inefficient, doesn't it? Anyway, that is something that the report goes into, which we didn't touch on. Of course, is the racial element. So the country is highly, inequality on racial lines is rampant. But let's go on to actually,
So just to sort of finish off on this sort of summit, if we're on that. So obviously the summit itself, just after what the Chinese have just pointed out there, the whole thing is a bit of a joke in itself. And then when you look at who is attending, so Israel, as we've just said, which is in a state of flames at the moment after their government, Netanyahu, who is backed by popular demand apparently, but is now one of the most unpopular men in Israel because he's just made effectively a power grab to take over the courts. Because he's actually been investigated for fraud. He was under investigation for fraud when he actually made his presidential run. A deeply corrupt and criminal man in himself, who is now trying to take over the courts effectively so he can't be indicted. He is one of the guest speakers at the Summit for Democracy. Taiwan, which famously is not a country, is at the Summit for Democracy. Hungary have been banned from it.
Hungary's not there, I know that. And Turkey's also not invited, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So Hungary's good enough to be part of NATO, good enough to be part of the EU, but not good enough to be part of the Summit for Democracy. I think that says a lot more about the EU than it does about Hungary.
Right. Yeah. It's as some I think the CPI has already called it the summit of hypocrisy rather than the summit of democracy. Good soundbite for that one. I actually wanted to play. So the Chinese counter summit conference, whatever you want to call it, the one that they held, where they invited all sorts of people. They have an individual, I believe he's from the Zambian Socialist Party. So it's quite a long video, but it's actually all very good. So I'm going to put him up here. He is speaking in Beijing at this conference, and he said some really, really good stuff.
Country that supported colonial regimes, the apartheid regime in South Africa, the white racist minority regime in Zimbabwe, now Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, the Portuguese colonial governments in Mozambique, in Angola, in Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde, today is coming to Africa to teach us about democracy. A country that has toppled so many governments in Africa, that has led so many coups in Africa and other parts of the world, a country that has killed so many of our leaders in Africa and other parts of the world. The killers of Patrice Lumumba, those who toppled Kwame Nkrumah.
So just a quick interjection on that one. So Patrice Lumumba obviously is the independence leader from the Congo. And yes, the US, the CIA are involved in his capture and execution. But on the flip side, I believe, I don't know if you know this or not, Chris, but the one of the universities in Moscow has just renamed itself Patrice Lumumba University.
Oh, no, I didn't know that. I thought it was quite interesting because Lumumba, one of the reasons why they had him killed, they accused him of being a communist. And he wasn't. He actually very sort of politically, I don't want to say flaky, but he didn't really have a very defined political ideology other than liberation, independence for Congo. Of course, what came after of Zaire and the dictatorship afterwards brought the country to absolute ruin and was defended to the bitter end by Ronald Reagan and his regime.
Yeah. Mobutu Sese Seko.
Yeah.
And also that country, I mean, that's the one of the probably the greatest tragedy of Africa is the Congo, because ever since the West, the French and the Americans organized to get him assassinated, Congo has been, the eastern part of the country has been in chaos. There's been civil wars and really never a day of peace and progress for them.
I think one thing that people don't realize is the border between the two Congos, the Republic of Congo and the Democratic Republic. That's been one of the longest. The dog in the background. That's been one of the longest conflicts in the world at this point. That's still open trenches fighting. Absolute, and it's just sort of ignored by the West.
Absolutely. Well, actually, in worse so. I mean, obviously, it's a complex region. Rwanda and Kagame is the leader of Rwanda. He's done very good things for the economy, but one of the sort of odd things is, of course, the Congolese accuse him of funding lots of rebels. And in the east of the Congo, you have lots of cobalt and rare earth materials. Now, Rwanda itself doesn't have many of these reserves, but if you look at Rwanda's exports, it's one of the biggest exporters of those materials, particularly cobalt. So you can kind of say, well, where did you get the stuff from? Well, East Congo is just over the border, and that's where it's from, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Unfortunately, Rwanda is now going to be one of the biggest importers of British immigrants as well. Unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. So I think we should do an episode on Rwanda, actually, because it's a very interesting situation there, because economically they're doing very well and actually have assisted in terms of regional politics. With fighting ISIS, for example, ISIS in Mozambique. But yeah, let's go into that another time. Let's just see what else this guy has to say.
Those who killed Nasser, those who killed Muammar Gaddafi, today are coming to teach us about democracy. A country that has been built on a brutal force, on enslavement of other human beings, on the humiliation of Africans, the exploitation of Africans, the plunder of Africa, today is coming to teach us about democracy. That's the arrogance, the imperialist arrogance, the racist arrogance that we are subjected to. We cannot have democracy where there's hegemony of the strongest, mightiest imperialist power. We cannot have democracy where a country's resources, a country's decisions are dictated to by another country. A country that is dominated by another country cannot be democratic. A country that lacks sovereignty cannot be democratic. A people that cannot decide for themselves cannot be democratic. A colony, a neo-colony cannot be democratic. That's why today, even at the United Nations, membership is on the basis of sovereignty. Only sovereign nations can be members of the United Nations, because only sovereign nations can decide for themselves. A colony cannot be a member of the United Nations. It's not by accident. It's not a mistake. If you have no respect for the dignity of others, if you have no respect for the sovereignty of other countries, you cannot claim to be a champion of democracy. They used to say, all roads lead to Rome. Today, we can confidently say, all roads to progress, all roads to what is better for humanity lead to Beijing. This is a country, this is a people that have developed themselves, that has developed itself without colonizing any country in the world, without plundering any country in the world, without subjugating any people in the world. This is a country that is developing with maximum respect for others, for their history, for their cultures, and recognizes the diversity that is there in civilization. We were only taught one form of civilization, one form of modernization. That was the Western way. Westernness was a measure of how civilized, how modern you are. We reject that. We reject it because it's not correct. We reject it because it's undemocratic. We reject it because it's uncivilized to think of the world and of other people in that way. Today, they cannot accept the fact that China has caught up with them. China is about to surpass them in many areas of human endeavor. The imperialist arrogance is inhibiting them from accepting that reality. The racist arrogance is inhibiting them from accepting that reality. But the world is changing. The changes we are witnessing today, as President Xi said in Moscow recently, or the other day, they have never been seen in 100 years. They have shaped a world that they themselves today are scared of. And they have shaped a world that is not sustainable. Democracy, human development is not sustainable on the basis of plunder, on the basis of enslavement, on the basis of humiliating other people every day. That is a system we are seeing today, a system that will not survive if plunder is eliminated, if subjugation of other peoples, other nations is eliminated, if inequality in the world is eliminated, that system will disappear. The only system that can survive and can endure for long is a system that is based on mutual benefit, win-win relationships, mutual respect for others, accommodation and tolerance of others, and fraternal love for all humanity. This is what we find in China today. This is what China's example is showing us. Indeed, all paths are different. There's no path that is the same, even if they are leading to the same destination. Each path has got its own characteristics. We are seeing that, we are learning that, we are experiencing that today with China. There are many things that need to be done.
Here we go.
A country that was opposed to...
There we go. All right.
All right, walk straight, bud. You go down there, you scare those kids on the right.
Sorry, something else started playing. That was excellent. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that might be one of the best speeches of summarizing the last few years and the next couple of years of where things are going, development, geopolitics, the right path. There's a lot of stuff there. I think it was actually one of the best speeches of recent times, actually. And he was reading from the heart. There's no paper there.
Was it Botswana?
I have no idea.
I think doesn't know what party he is with, because he sounded like a Marxist. Like there were definitely some aspects of it that you could have literally swapped some words out when he was talking about different paths leading to the same location and stuff. It sounded like literally that, like I've read that in Marx before. Just the certain words would have been swapped with certain other words. But it literally sounded like he was paraphrasing verses there.
Yeah, he did also say what he did have a take of what is to be done. It was a slight
yes, I heard that as well.
So, yeah, I don't know. We'll find out, and we'll provide it for next week when we'll find out who that is. I think it's excellent.
Spotted there a certain Scottish fedora wearing. Did you spot the fedora?
Yeah,
spot Galloway in the front row. I think Galloway did give a speech at this as well.
He did. I haven't got that one, but he did give a speech too. A good speech.
I've seen it. I recommend anyone to watch it if you haven't. But obviously, the whole conference was quite good. Obviously, it always makes me laugh. With there was as a Kenyan official recently put it, every time China visits Africa, they get a hospital. Every time the British visit Africa, they get a lecture.
Yes, I've heard that one. Yeah. So lecturing us on democracy. Yeah. And actually, speaking of Africans speaking for themselves and standing up for themselves and saying interesting things and having good speeches, we've got, of course, something we didn't mention when we talked about Russia was the ICC calling Putin a war criminal, which they didn't do for Bush or Blair. And actually, when they talked about doing this for U.S. soldiers, they were threatened with bombing by Pompeo. But we'll leave that to the side. They've released they're saying they're going to we all have to arrest Putin now. If he arrives at your airport and you're a signature of ICC, you're going to have to arrest him. He's a criminal. But I'll show you what Malema had to say for that one.
So it is a pretty shocking move in itself. Obviously, my first thought of when it happened was, Putin's a little bit white for this, isn't he? I thought the ICC was essentially built primarily for sort of African leaders, isn't it?
Well,
that's why it seems to be for. I've never heard of a white man being African leader.
Yeah.
Other than obviously, you've got a few Yugoslav, Croatian, Serbs, who have been indicted in it before. But generally speaking, this is it's a show, isn't it? And as he just alluded to it in that speech there, Bush was never indicted. Tony Blair was never indicted. They killed Saddam for something that he didn't have weapons. Yes. They killed Gaddafi. They said Gaddafi was going door to door, killing people. He was on the ground saying these people are ISIS. And there was, no, they're not. Shut up. And they were ISIS.
Yes, yeah, yes. I mean, also, we also going back to the Syria conversation. That was the whole thing as well. You know, the Syrian democratic troops were actually just members of ISIS or Al Qaeda or whatever other crap name they've come up with. Let's just play this one from Julius Malema. It's only 1 minute, quickly. His thoughts on the ICC warrant for Putin.
We don't want ICC's hypocrisy to apply here in our country. President Putin is welcomed. We know our friends. We know the people who liberated us. We know the people who supported us. In Kutokonaval, the weapons that were used in Kutokonaval that led to the liberation of South Africa were coming from Russia. Russia supplied us with weapons in Kutokonaval. Cuba supplied us with soldiers. MK was drunk. Cuba brought the soldiers. Russia brought the armaments. We were supposed to be the ones that are being complimented and supported by these other countries who were found wanting.
Okay, yeah. So in another video, he actually says, if Putin lands here, we will escort him to the meeting and he will be safe and we will escort him back. But he's also still correct. He's absolutely correct with the historical
Putin is welcome here and no one's going to arrest Putin. If need be, we will go and fetch Putin from the airport, take him to the meeting where we will address and finish his meeting, and we will take him back to the airport. It's obviously just another example of the sort of tentacles of the West. Sort of they're losing their sock on their targets. Obviously, just to sort of explain who he is, just so I'll let you just sort of explain, because I know you're quite big into this particular party, aren't you?
Yeah. So that's Julius Malema. He's the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is a Marxist-Leninist party in South Africa, opposing the ANC. They recently just led the national shutdown, which was aiming to gather people to protest, to go on strike, to demand Ramaphosa to resign. Ramaphosa being the leader of the ANC. Because there's lots of blackouts. I don't know if you noticed on the top right-hand side of the screen, it said level 3 blackouts. So yes, there's a massive problem with electricity in South Africa at the moment, and it's because of corruption primarily. And yeah, Malema's party is doing something about that, trying to get the government to deal with it, or to resign, and for the president to leave his seat. And also at the same time, yes, the president was found with having $500,000 in a sofa. But to be honest, it's a long story to get into. That's just who Malema is. He's a freedom fighter, a revolutionary in South Africa with a lot of support. More than a million members in his party.
I think they're the third biggest at the moment, aren't they, in the South African Parliament? Third biggest party.
In Parliament, yes. In Parliament, yeah.
It is really impressive, especially for a party that is, I think they're like 10 years old, aren't they?
10 years old, that's it. 10 years just right now. Yeah, 10 years.
Yeah, it is incredibly... Well, yeah, it is very, very impressive to see that that's managed to accomplish it, especially in this post-communist world we've been told that we live in. That groups like this are still there, still developing, still getting massive successes. Yeah,
no, I mean, the guys in the EFF will wear a shirt that says Marx on it. They've got red berets. They are, they speak like Marxists and communists, because they are Marxists and communists. And not as in a derogatory sense, that these people really care about their country, South Africa, and they really want to, take it and within their hands and liberate the impoverished masses who are working in the mines for very rich British companies and American companies. And
that's one of their demands, isn't it, to nationalize the South African mines, isn't it?
Yeah. So 10 years ago, if you remember, you had the Marikana massacre, where miners at Lonmin, which is a London mining company platinum mine, was shot by the police. 12 or 13 of them killed. This party was formed after that, 6 months after that massacre. And it's one of the founding sort of reasons was to nationalize the mines and to liberate the country from foreign capital. But we should do a special on them. They're a fascinating party. They've got, and also South African politics in general after apartheid. It's interesting to look at. After Mandela, basically.
Yeah, definitely. I think we should do that on a bigger one. I think actually to have a bit of a deeper look into some of, not just South Africa, but a lot of the African parties in general. I think
Yes,
there's quite
yes, I'd
there's
love to do
quite
that.
a lot of interesting stuff going on. That it's such a big continent that just sort of gets overlooked. I think because for an outsider, it can look just so confusing to where do I start in terms of understanding the political powers that are at play there. So people just don't bother.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Sure. It is a big continent
Yeah.
with lots of things going on and lots of different groups and lots of regionality as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we can finally
should
answer the question of how did Chad get Romania's flag?
Right. Actually, speaking of Chad, they just nationalized their oil. They just took ExxonMobil's assets. Maybe they'll be having a summit for democracy there. The Americans are going to sponsor one for them soon. We'll see. And if you're watching this actually, and you do think we should talk about those things at some point, please just comment and tell us. So we read all of the comments. So if you have a suggestion of something that we want to watch, please do that. So the next one then, Chris, is I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. I wanted to play something that we actually managed to get organized in relation to obviously TikTok. So we just mentioned China and the summit that the Chinese are hosting, but another interesting gathering, congressional hearing that's happening in America right now and has been happening all week is a bunch of congressmen have been interrogating the CEO of TikTok. And today, actually, the Ministry of Propaganda managed to get Senator McCarthy, the infamous Senator McCarthy of the 1950s, to conduct his own interview of the CEO of TikTok. And this is what he had to say. And this is what he said.
When you appeared before us today, it was pointed out to you that you were born with a Chinese name given to you after the Chinese Communist Revolution had occurred. It was pointed out to you then that this would indicate that you, your company, and your parents must have been in sympathy with the communist regime. So, yes or no, how much private data are you sharing with the communists?
Congressman, first, I'm Singaporean.
That's fine, but your name sounds kind of Chinesey.
We understand this concern. In my opening statement, we said we hear these concerns. We didn't try to avoid them or trivialize them. We built something where we take that data and put it out of reach.
That's exactly what a liar would say. Let's move on and give you another chance to try and tell the truth. Can you tell me right now, with 100% certainty, that TikTok does not use the phone's camera to determine whether the content that elicits a pupil's dilation should be amplified by the algorithm? Can you tell me that?
We do not collect body, face, or voice data to identify our users. We do not.
You don't?
No. The only face data that you get, that we collect, is when you use the filters to have, say, sunglasses on your face. We need to know where your eyes are.
Why do you need to see where the eyes are if they are not dilated?
And that data is stored on your local device and deleted after use if you use it for facial. Again, we do not collect body, face, or voice data to identify our users.
I find that hard to believe. It's our understanding that they are looking at the eyes. How do you determine what age they are then?
We rely on age gating as our key age gating, which is when you ask the user what age they are. We have also developed some tools where we look at their public profile to go through the videos that they post to see whether...
Tell me more about that.
It's public. So if you post a video, you choose that video to go public, that's how you get people to see your video. We look at those to see if it matches up the age that you talked about.
Boy, that's creepy. Mr. Chu, does TikTok access the home Wi-Fi network?
Only if the user turns on the Wi-Fi. I'm sorry, I may not understand the...
So, if I have the TikTok app on my phone and my phone is on my Wi-Fi network, does TikTok access that network?
You will have to access the network to get connections to the internet, if that's the question.
Is it possible then that it could access other devices on that home Wi-Fi network?
Congressman, we do not do anything that is beyond any industry norms. I believe the answer to your question is no. It could be technical. Let me get back to you.
Okay, yes, please look into that. But my concerns are not yet satisfied. I have other questions. If I have TikTok on my phone, might it take my mother out for a nice meal and then not call her back?
Yes.
So there you go.
Yeah, that was very entertaining.
Yes, yeah. We might be seeing a bit more of Senator McCarthy. We're considering, obviously, hiring for the Ministry of Propaganda. He might be a regular correspondent for us, asking those important questions.
Yeah,
as well as
that'd be a good foil.
Yeah. Okay. So, oh yes, just the last one then is also Latuff, the artist, French artist that also, we looked at some of his art earlier, also made another nice, similarly inspired little cartoon here about the TikTok inquiry, the ghost of Joseph McCarthy coming to ask them about TikTok. But we got him to actually interview, so I think we might have been better than Latuff in this case. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a funny little ghost hunt, isn't it? Because I remember the same thing happening in reverse with Pokemon Go back in 2015, where a lot of countries were banning Pokemon Go for the Americans doing the exact same thing, using it because effectively it was a GPS camera, wasn't it? You're filming your entire surroundings, and that's being then sent to an American company in the States. And when you do read these companies' terms, a lot of the times they do openly admit that they'll provide that information to anybody who basically comes knocking for it. But obviously, in terms of TikTok, as I believe this guy pointed out, everything's in America. I mean, this does seem to be a public-driven ghost hunt.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and also just to clarify, the McCarthy was actually asking questions. 80% of the questions were actual questions asked by the actual.
He asked those questions.
He asked questions. Yeah, those were questions that they asked. Those were not all made up. But yeah, so but yeah, I just feel like there's huge amnesia here. Have we forgotten what Edward Snowden said? Do we have forgotten who Edward Snowden is? Do we not remember him, being interviewed by The Guardian and putting a blanket over his head to access his computer because he said, if they can see your eyes, effectively the reflection from your eyes enough for them to not isolate it, whatever. The point being is that the power to access data by the NSA and other intelligence agencies is ridiculous. So TikTok, doing stuff that Facebook and whatever have already been doing, and not to say that TikTok has even done that yet. I don't feel like there's been any smoking gun, and they haven't been charged with anything yet. This is just a hearing to try and find something. But it is also 1950s in many respects because of the fear. So you have an ailing America trying to stir up Cold War politics, the Summit for Democracy and Freedom and all that kind of stuff, and trying to build, as the Chinese would call it, this Cold War mentality. So they're struggling. And then also, it also doesn't feel a bit like the the Sputnik moment when the Americans saw Sputnik fly over America and were terrified. So I guess you could say the Chinese spy balloon was a sort of maybe a reminder of of Sputnik flying over, but not representing for space stuff, but representing TikTok. That the fact that the American people, their youth, 150 million subscribers or whatever it is, 150 million people on the app, which is most of America. Yeah, a Chinese technology, Chinese soft power, if you want to use that expression, is in pockets and in the minds of all of Americans.
And that's what it is. It's regardless of whether there's any truth in the allegations. What's important to America is that they're making the allegations in the first place. It's blaming China for anything just for the sake of blaming. Just to keep that Red Scare alive and going in the minds of people. If China hadn't invented TikTok, America would have had to invent it themselves and then blame China for it.
Yeah. Right. Or that they're hacking it. Yeah, it doesn't. This is one of those. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Sort of. Things.
So what they did before to that with Huawei.
Yeah. This is also again
same allegation.
Yes, and the chips also. So it's if you start losing the game, you just stop. You just break the game. You stop playing. You just fine. You can't buy chips. Your phone company can't operate here. Your app can't operate here. Okay, yeah, just change the game if you're losing. Basically, that's pretty sad in a sense, actually, because it's inevitable that the US will be, comparatively smaller than someone at some point, whether that's China or India, whatever. And a sort of final point I wanted to mention is that if we're bringing this back to the unipolar, multipolar world discussion, it is mad that I think it's 5% of the world's population thinks that it has the right to dictate terms to the rest of the world. But even though that is fading away, and we're seeing the beginning of the end of that, I don't think, and this is actually from Jeffrey Sachs on the Duran, he said this, that it means that the 17% or whatever it is that the Chinese are going to replace them. They will not be a hegemon in the same way.
No.
We're seeing a change to a different world, a new kind of world.
I think we are seeing that very, very quickly develop. And I think a lot of people in the West, a lot of commentators, a lot of politicians in the West, I've got the head in the sand and refusing to see basically the writing on the wall regarding this, that the time is sort of up for that, of American hegemony. And I always say that this would sort of bring an end to the United States of America in that sense, not from any military conflict, but America is based on the notion that it is number one. And as soon as it's not number one anymore, that's basically its reason for being gone. If it's not the number one military power, if it's not the number one economic power, then what the hell is it doing even together? At that point, you'll have your movements in California to leave, you'll have your movements in Texas to leave. Like California, if it was to leave America, would be still one of the richest countries in the world.
Yes.
And I feel like that will become a notion. Like, if we're not number one, then we're nothing.
It's an interesting proposal. I mean, I would hope that there wouldn't be a split or a war or something like this. I hope that they could find a comfortable place to live out, a decent spot in the world, one of the top countries, of course, still very powerful, still very important. But obviously playing by the new rules, that would be the best, I think. But I can also agree with you. I think that if
those Brits will be able to teach them a few tricks, like it's not so bad being number two.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, I think it's good for this thing. Oh, you want one more point? Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I want to just sort of plug something quickly, just whilst we're on the subject.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
So on the 29th of April, there is a conference coming up, a seminar summit, being hosted by Alexander Dugin. So this is the Global Conference on Multipolarism and Fourth Political Theory. So this is basically as it says in the tin. So I would recommend people wouldn't check it out. There's a resignation. What's the word? The word has gone. Registration online. The whole thing is just on Zoom, so you're not having to go anywhere, but it is an all-day sort of seminar. People sort of discussing multipolarism, which is 90% of what we discuss on the show. So chances are, if you like our content, you'll like some of the speakers here. Obviously, Dugin will be speaking. That in itself is going to be quite an interesting sort of talk. So I would recommend people to go and check that out.
What's the date again for that, Chris? When is that happening?
That's the 29th of April.
Okay, so a month from now. Okay, great. Yeah. Cool. So yes, please register for that one if you want. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comments, please. In the comments, put any ideas, suggestions, or any thoughts on what we've discussed tonight. And we will catch you next week. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you very much.